anybody who spent some time doing some serious writing and has produced a manuscript or multiple manuscripts has gone out there looking for a literary agent. And that particular species of the industry is one of the most frustrating. And they're frustrated too. Let's be clear about this. They are inundated with manuscripts from people who may or may not be good writers, may or may not be resubmitting something that's already been rejected under a different headline and maybe a slightly rewritten opening. These are some of the things we're going to get into with our guest today, Andy Ross. He's a literary agent at Ross Literary Agency, and it's got a really interesting background. But the thing that we always want to keep in mind is that you take a book like the Confederacy of Dunces, and it was rejection after rejection after rejection. And then he worked for years with the famous editor, Andy, who am I thinking of? The famous editor who just retired recently. He worked with Bill Clinton on his book. He's now writing some of his own books. His bio. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Bob Gottlieb.
Bob Gottlieb, a legend in the industry. He worked for years with Bob Gottlieb, who said, listen, this is a book that's really about nothing. It ended up finally getting published with a lot of help from Bob Gottlieb, although I don't think he ultimately pulled the trigger on that one. I think it was somebody else published it and won the Pulitzer Prize posthumously because sadly, John Kennedy Toole committed suicide. We're not going to blame his agents for that. His would-be the literary agents who turned him down. We're not going to blame Bob Gottlieb either because Bob Gottlieb told him he was brilliant and worked with him on all that. But what we need to know is what is the life of a literary agent? And now one agent doesn't speak for the whole species, but Andy Ross has been in the business for some time and he understands the whys and wherefores of this business. He can tell us what we're doing wrong. He can tell us what we're doing right. And it's not always wrong and right either, I don't think, Andy. Andy, first of all, welcome to the program. Welcome to Novelist Spotlight.
Thanks for inviting me, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
We're glad you're in the spotlight. And for those of you who are listening to your first podcast, the first Novelist Spotlight podcast, my name is Mike Consul. I'm a host and producer of the program. And one of the things I wanted to tell you about Andy, that when I was saying he's got an interesting background, he owned Cody's books in Berkeley, California for 30 years. And if you're a Bay Area person or you've spent time in the Bay Area, there's a really good chance that you are thinking, oh, yeah, of course, Cody's books. It was a landmark for many, many years. And then the internet came along and Amazon came along and things changed. Let's start right there, Andy. I wanted to ask you, because you were, for 30 years, 3 decades, you were dealing with people who are inveterate readers coming into your store, picking books, purchasing them, and you must have gotten all kinds of intelligence about readers, their preferences, their habits. What did you learn?
Well, I can't answer that in just so many words. I did get to, one of the things I enjoyed so much about owning a bookstore was talking to readers and just seeing the kind of books they were buying. And it served me very well when I became an agent because I really knew, I knew all of the publishers, I knew their strengths and weaknesses, and I knew, the best places to submit my clients' books. Cody's was a really exciting place, and it's unfortunate, I guess, that it finally closed. But they, we got hurt. The people, their buying habits changed, and they started purchasing more online. And actually, we used to sell a lot of books to students and graduate students, and they quit reading as much. And I kind of realized.
You mean they quit buying as much, or they quit reading as much?
Well, they quit reading. Not just buying, they quit reading, and that's still the case now. They read textbooks or they read sections of textbooks, but they don't seem to read as much in their spare time. Or they, I remember when I realized that probably our time was up. We were kind of an academic bookstore. We were 3 blocks from the greatest public university in the world. And we sold books on philosophy and science. It was a pretty high level clientele. And I remember I was pulling returns, which the computer generates lists of returns for books that haven't sold in 6 or 9 months or something. And I saw that the computer expected us to return the final copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the most important work of Western philosophy in the last 300 years. And I realized that if we couldn't sell that book, then our time was up. But we did a lot of good stuff. I feel pretty proud of what we did. And I have moved on to become a literary agent, which is at the other end of the literary food chain.
And what motivated you to do that, to become a literary agent after you were a bookseller, owning the famous Cody's?
Well, I really didn't know what I was going to do because I'd been a bookseller all my life. I thought I'd be sacking groceries at Safeway, but I don't know. I just woke up one night and decided I would do this, and on a whim, I guess. And I've been doing it now for about 12 years.
Now, did you understand what you were getting yourself into at that time? Did you already know literary agents and how they operated, or did you just decide I'm going to start accepting manuscripts, put a shingle out?
I knew a little bit. I didn't. When I think back on it, I realized how much I didn't know. And now, but the fact that I had been a bookseller for so long and I sort of knew the territory really gave me an advantage. I still had to learn things about how to write a book proposal. By the way, the best book on how to write a book proposal is written by me. It's called The Literary Agent's Guide to Writing a Nonfiction Book Proposal. But at the time, I didn't know what a book proposal was, so I kind of had to learn it by the seat of my pants. And it's a lot simpler than being a bookseller, which is fantastically complicated. I had 100 employees. I had to order books. I ordered 10 or 15,000 books every year, new titles. I had to deal with real estate. I had to deal with politics. Being an agent, you represent one person and you try to sell their book. You put together a book proposal, or you work on their novel, you edit it, you make it as good as you can possibly do. Then you make a list of publishers and editors who would make likely homes for the books, and you send it out and see who would be interested.
Now, I want to tell our listeners that you can learn more about Andy at his website, and I'll put the link you'll find down in the program notes. So, and the reason I bring that up is actually what motivated me to even say that is that you can see on there. I think some of you are probably wondering, so who does Andy Ross represent? Well, he's got a block of a lot of names there of authors who he represents. So if you want to kind of get a sense of what really makes his eyebrows jump, you can take a look at that list. Now, so you become a literary agent. Our listeners, we're about fiction writing. We're about novels, whether it's genre writing or
right.
And I wanted to jump back to the bookstore for a minute because you must have had a lot of regular customers. I want to be a little more specific with you. And those customers, some of them are probably genre readers. Some came in and it was like anything John le Carré came out with. That's not a good example of a genre reader because he was also very literary. But say, Elmore Leonard, another good writer, but a genre writer. Certain people would just like, hey, I'm only science fiction, or I'm only detective novels, or I'm only these three authors, and I read everything they put out. And then there's the people who are always looking for new discovery, I would imagine. I know you had a lot of customers, and you had a lot on your mind. Did you tend to know a lot about your customers in that you could tell that, hey, genre writing is what, when it comes to fiction, genre writing runs the table? Or did you not find that to be the case?
We had some genres were stronger than other genres. Science fiction and mysteries were always a strong genre. Romances was pretty much non-existent. We had a great YA and middle grade buyer and a great section. But I think we excelled more in literary and general kind of upmarket fiction is what we call it.
Now, so you become a literary agent. You learn as you go, and by the time COVID came around, you were quite experienced. And there's been a lot of talk that people ended up locked up in their homes, and what did they have to do besides watch Netflix and Prime, Amazon Prime? I've heard that there was a real uptick in the number of manuscripts submitted to literary agents. Did you really see an uptick, or was that not the case?
I get this. I get the same amount, more or less, every day. I get usually 10 to 20 submissions a day. Actually, it's probably
a day,
like 10, but I get them on Christmas Day, and I'm not sure there were more or less as a result of COVID.
What is the quality of most manuscripts? Because one of the things, maybe this is me being hopeful, but I've seen a lot of people write. I'm in the writing profession. I mean, as a magazine editor and writer and so on, and anybody who's in the business knows that there's damn few people who can write well at all. So when you take out, for every 10 manuscripts, how many of them are deplorable versus, hey, I think I'll read a little bit more deeply?
Well, I don't read most of the fiction manuscripts I get submitted to me because I just don't have enough time. I can't really tell you exactly what magic words I see that makes me want to read one and disregard another. Right now, I'm working on a number of fiction manuscripts, and so I'm not really looking for more. I don't have time for it. Most of the ones I see that just kind of come in we call disparagingly the slush pile, which
we know it well.
are unsolicited queries. They aren't that good. But I have found I have gotten, there was one book I got from the slush pile that won an international award. I mean, and I have gotten nonfiction books published from the slush pile. There is myself and other agents do go through the slush pile and they look for things. Now, the problem with fiction is that in some ways it has to be good, but that's not good enough. Publishers are really selective, and they make decisions based more on marketing than on literary quality. There's gotta be high literary quality. It'll be rejected right away. And everyone can see if a person is a good writer on the first page. They can't tell if the book's going to work on the first page, but they can see if the person has talent. But then, once you pass that sort of threshold, they are extremly selective. I once did a blog and I talked to a literary fiction editor and I asked her what, her batting averages were. And she had a list of all the submissions she had gotten for the entire year. And she said she had received about 250 submissions. And I asked her how many were agented, which meant they were heavily, heavily vetted. And she said all of them were. And I asked her how many were good enough to get published. And she said about half of them. And then I asked her how many actually did get published by her. And she said 2. So they make it's even if you're good, it doesn't mean that you're going to get published. And I have to, when I take on a new client, particularly a fiction client, I have to give them this kind of stern lecture that they have to be able to handle rejection because there's a lot of it in this business, sort of like being an actor in Hollywood. And if they cannot handle it, and I understand I have problems with rejections. I think, as an agent, I get rejected a lot.
The editors, right? You go to an editor.
I get rejection letters from editors. I tell people it's, my job is sort of like my social life in high school. But but I can only imagine what it's like for my authors. But I kind of tell them up front that they just have to be able to handle it because the hardest job I have, and every agent will say the same thing, is managing the unreasonable expectations of their clients and having to deal with sort of psychic trauma when their book gets rejected. Because more often than not, every book I've ever had has been by people who are extremely talented, whose books are perfect at one level, but they still get rejected. And that's just the way this business works.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about the marketing, because they look at it more from a marketing standpoint. Okay, it has to pass muster in terms of the quality of the writing, and it's got to have a story that holds together. But then the marketing aspect, when you talk about that, is it like legal thrillers are hot right now, and here's a legal thriller? Or what are the marketing calculations that you see right now?
Well, it's not quite that simple. I don't think you can't follow the trends. If you're writing, I remember when I first got into this business, vampire books were hot. Okay.
Yes.
Because of Twilight. But by the time somebody got around to writing a vampire book, because that's the trend.
Because of Anne Rice, Andy.
Now,
you must have sold Anne Rice books. Anne Rice was the one who started the vampire thing.
Did indeed, right?
And she never made as much money as the Twilight author. I forget her name now, but Stephanie, I think.
Stephanie, whatever her name is. Well, that's true.
And Anne Rice, Anne Rice was the one.
Twilight series sold more than Harry Potter.
Oh, is that right? More than Harry Potter?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. I didn't even realize that, but that's amazing. Okay, and she cannot write at a level that Anne Rice writes at, because Anne Rice is a very sensual writer. And I remember Anne Rice being interviewed, and she had said she said it just came to me, the idea of a vampire came to me, and she said it was that I understood with the things that I wanted to say, I'd be able to say through vampires, which sounds ridiculous at first. But if anybody's ever read an Anne Rice book, I mean, my wife has read pretty much her entire collection, loves her stuff. And she's a great writer, and she came up with a lot of great ideas. Now she's slowed down. Now I don't even know if she's coming out with books.
She just died this week.
Oh my God. I didn't know that.
Rest in peace. Yeah. She was.
Yeah. And I just 3 weeks ago, I had approached about her getting her on the program, and wow. Rest in peace is right. That's sad. Okay. So Anne Rice has moved on. Okay.
She has.
Wow.
She was a great writer, and she did get the kind of vampire thing started, but she wrote her novels were literary novels, and most of the vampire books that were selling when I first got into this business were teen fiction.
Yeah. Like YA fiction. That's Stephanie Meyer or something like that. It's Stephanie Meyer. Okay.
Right. So, although a lot of adults read the Twilight series too.
Yes,
a lot of adults liked YA.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a broad market then. So, I want to ask you, what do you look for in a new fiction author? But you're not looking for fiction authors right now. You're saying that you're kind of full up.
I've picked up several of them in the last few months. So even though
Tell me what they brought to you. Tell me what they brought to you. What did they bring to you that it was like sold you on their talent, their manuscript?
In this business, it's sort of elusive. It's ineffable. But I can see in the first paragraph. I get excited on the first paragraph, and
you got to go deeper now.
What
about that? Give me an example of the first paragraph. Like
one of my clients' books if you have time.
Yeah, read us a first paragraph that dazzled you, so that we kind of understand.
I will do that. What it really is. It's not. It's voice, and voice is ineffable, but really voice is everything, and you can't define voice exactly, and it's hard to teach voice. It's not like, learning how to handle point of view or, the usual craft items, but you can see voice really, really easily. And I do a class on first paragraphs, which I teach in writers' conferences and stuff. And, I've got a wide selection of books, and, the ones that have, some of them are from my slush pile, which I've made some changes, but, everyone can see what good writing is. It's very simple. So I'll read you the first paragraph of Beauty of the Broken by Tawny Waters. It's a teen novel. I was the agent for it, and it won the International Literacy Association Award. It's a brilliant book, and it's what we call voice driven. And you can see on that first paragraph what I'm talking about, I think. Okay?
Okay, let's hear
So
it.
I will read it for you.
I'm excited now.
It's about a teenage girl in a small town who realizes she's a lesbian, and it's a town that's dominated by homophobic pastor, and she has a father. She has a really dysfunctional family with a violent father.
And none of what you knew when you read the first paragraph, but the first paragraph captured you and you kept reading.
Well, it's interesting that she says so much in this first paragraph about what the book is about, but she says it by showing, not telling.
Okay.
But I will read it to you.
Please.
Mama and Willie McIntyre made Iggy in a barn. It was an act of passion, I heard my mama say to her cousin. She was on the phone at the kitchen table while Daddy was off on some hunting trip. Why she was bearing her heart to this relative she sees maybe once every 5 years, I don't know. She says she's like a sister to her, but I don't understand how, because they almost never talk. Then again, Daddy never did let Mama have friends, and he thinks Mama's family is a herd of godless heathens. He keeps us away from them, and Mama lets it happen. Mama lets Daddy do whatever the hell he wants. Why wouldn't she? He'd bust her wide open if she didn't. Plus, my guess is she's trying to make up for cheating on him all those years ago when they were engaged. As far as I can tell, it's not working. Daddy still hates Mama most days. So that's it. And you can
I see what you...
Yeah. It's voice. You can hear a lot. First of all, you know a huge amount about her family, but you also know a kind of, she has this sort of a country voice without being crudely using a crude dialect. You can just kind of tell from the rhythm of the tone that she's a girl, in the country, in a small town. Okay.
Picked that up right away. Absolutely.
You picked it up right away. She sounded like she's in the same room as you. And it's natural, it's believable, it's authentic, it's great writing.
It's autofiction, it sounds like, which is very hot these days. I mean, I'm going to throw this stuff out there, and you correct me, Andy, but autofiction is hot these days. What I'm hearing is that editors, agents, and so on, they like a strong commanding voice that takes readers from start to finish, where there's not the bouncing from character to character, where it can be, an example being an autobiography or biographies, which are very popular. Why? Because there's a singular voice that's telling the story pretty much all the way through. And people seem to really, and maybe it's just the time, maybe it's just changing sensibilities. But right now, people seem to want to sit down and say, tell me a story, make it conversational, and make it like you're talking directly to me.
Well, they want, John Gardner defined a novel as a vivid and continuous dream. And what that means is that the reader has to experience the novel. They don't want to understand a novel. They want to experience a novel. They're looking for experiencing, because we've all grown up on television and movies. And so a novel has to come alive. You have to lose yourself in it. And that usually the best way to do that is, one, building the novel around scenes, which are immediate by dialogue and action, not explanation. And also having kind of a close point of view, which can be in first person or third person, occasionally second person, but it usually sounds pretentious. First person is the most intimate. But if you're going to do a third person, you have to do a very close to who the main character is. And the 19th century was different. A lot of novels in the 19th century were done in kind of an omniscient point of view, where the writer kind of stood in a position close to God, right? Tolstoy was like that, or the Bronte sisters, or Jane Austen. And that's not really fashionable right now. It's difficult to write. There are some people who do that, but not that many. It's difficult to write, and it tends to be formal. very more formal than what readers are interested in. So it's kind of gone out of fashion. One of the reasons in YA that you see a lot of the writing is first person, and a lot of it is first person present, is because of the immediacy of that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And teenagers in particular, they've got to be right in there. Their emotions they wear on their sleeve. But yeah, it's the third person point of view. It is a truth universally acknowledged that blah, 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 blah. You can't do that now. Most people, it's far too formal. Now, what I do see with mediocre writing and bad writing is it's similar to an omniscient point of view, but it's different. It's like they go from one character to another, and we call it head hopping. It's extremely confusing to read. It's usually a sign to agents that the person is an inexperienced writer.
Interesting. So what immediately will turn you off about a fiction submission? Is it just, I think maybe you've already answered that. I mean, you're looking for voice. You know, within the first paragraph or certainly the first page, whether or not the person can write. But then you say beyond that, for instance, the first paragraph that you, exactly. Now,
voice is very difficult. And I tell people that, they should remember the quote by Duke Ellington, you don't have a thing if you ain't got that swing. But even if you get that swing, you have to have a story. You have to have compelling characters. You have to have a plot structure with a kind of a narrative arc, beginning, a middle, and an end. And a lot of novelists who have talent, who have a voice, they kind of get lost on about page 100. And they kind of start meandering. A good novel that has to have momentum. The reader has to stay interested. The stakes have to keep getting raised. And that doesn't always happen. Authors, even talented authors, they make bad choices, or they get lost themselves. And if the novel doesn't work, if I get bored on page 50 or page 100, then I can't sell it. Readers get bored very easily, and they are unforgiving, and they will usually, even after 5 pages, if the book hasn't started really, they will throw the book down and they'll never come back to it. That wasn't true in the 19th century. Again, people had more time, so that when you in Les Miserables, for instance, the main character Jean Valjean isn't introduced until about page 75. You can't do that now.
No. It's changed. And what about short form writing? It seems that short stories are maybe back in a way they haven't been for a long time. I mean, people today really, they read very short items. I'm not just thinking of social media, but they tend to be reading blog posts and such. Do you think short stories?
Publishers don't seem that interested in short stories. They're hard to sell. And the ones that get published, they're either by established authors, people who write for the New Yorker, stuff like that, or else the author has a really big novel that they want, and they agree to publish their books of short stories that they know won't sell.
So give us a story of a disastrous submission. Have you had one that was disastrous, that other than just, hey, it was bad writing, so I just threw it in the slush pile, or I kicked it to the corner?
One of the interesting things I have now, it's a kind of a disaster. It's a brilliant book by a brilliant writer, and I can't get it published because what's going on now in the industry, their publishers are afraid of what they are calling cultural appropriation. They want books with authentic voices from underrepresented groups, okay? And my client's book is in the voice of a 16-year-old Palestinian girl, but he's a white writer, and everyone's scared to acquire it. It's a brilliant book. The voice is authentic, but they're afraid to acquire it.
So this would be American Dirt all over again. They're afraid. It's
American
like,
Dirt
right?
had a huge influence on publishing, and it, in the sense that it just scared everybody off.
I mean, I think that's outrageous. I mean,
well,
she wrote a great book, and
it was a good book. She made some mistakes in trying to promote it, and apparently, according to my friends and clients who were Latino writers, they said that the problem was that her voice wasn't authentic. But what publishers have taken home from that is nobody can write an authentic voice unless they're part of that group that they're talking about, which makes no sense to me at all. Do you have to be a king to play King Lear?
Yes.
Tolstoy wasn't a woman, but he wrote Anna Karenina. And right now, you just can't do that. And it's kind of a tragedy, I think.
Yeah, Anne Patchett was the great novelist and bookstore owner. She owns a famous bookstore in Nashville. She came to her defense and said, the real issue here is that we still have problems with women making just a windfall of money, hitting it big, being famous. I don't know if I agree with that completely, because there's a lot of wealthy women out there who hit it big, and they're very much honored. They're revered. But Anne Patchett said, "I love that book. I still love that book." And the fact that maybe the voice was off on that, or they didn't have the ring of authenticity, it was still bringing the subject matter to perhaps white readers, while Hispanic readers are saying this isn't authentic. So I'm going to go on and find a different book.
Well, since I'm not Hispanic or Latino, I can't say with any authority how authentic it was. But publishers have taken have just become, because of that, they have become extremely skittish.
I get it. They're not known for profiles in bravery,
right?
Anyway, so let me ask you about this whole process. Now, my understanding is that an author, needs to sell to an agent, submit something, gets lucky. The agent says, "Wow, I like this. I want to represent it." That agent then needs to take his or her manuscript to an editor at a publishing house. You take it out to your people, and the idea there is you get an editor excited about it. I like this a lot. But then that editor has to turn around and take it to the team of editors and sell a team of editors at the publishing house on it. And there's basically a vote as to whether they're going to move forward with it before the book would finally get published. Is that scenario accurate or not?
It's close, and it's actually harder than that. Typically, you need to find an editor who gets committed to it, and frequently they'll sort of send it around to other people in the office to read it and get feedback from it. But at the end, if they decide that they want to proceed, they always have an acquisition meeting once a week or once a month, whenever it is. And at the acquisition meeting are all of the editors, plus the people in marketing and sales, and the publisher, who is their boss. And they make their presentation, and they collectively decide if they want to acquire the book, and they talk about marketing. They say things like, "Well, this is kind of interesting, but we had a book with a similar concept and it didn't do very well 3 years ago." And and then it gets dropped. Or the sales department said, we had a book by that author, and the book didn't have good sales numbers. We don't want to do it again. So that it has to pass through kind of 3 or 4 different, levels. And then, the sales department has to take it to a bookseller. And the bookseller will either, will reject it, will decide not to carry it, or might carry 1 copy. So it's
the bookseller knows
right,
bookseller knows their audience. So now you operate out of Oakland, California, not New York City. Most agents, of course, are in New York. Is it an advantage or a disadvantage to be in Oakland?
doesn't matter anymore because the myth of the publisher's lunch over several martinis is probably just that, a myth. Everything now, the large publishers are owned by multimedia conglomerates, and it is a big business. It's not based on personal relationships. So that for nonfiction, they mostly buy books based on book proposals. And for fiction, they will look at the manuscript. But you know what they're really interested in? If they see a novel by a previously published novel, they will look at their past sales. And if the past sales are modest, it's going to be really difficult to sell their new project.
You know, I said on a podcast a few months ago that the self-publishing business is maybe a godsend to publishing houses because people will publish their own book. And if they've got marketing moxie, they get out there and they push it and they sell. And publishing agents, publishing houses, etc., can look at that and say, who's really selling books? Who's already caught on and has demonstrated that there's an audience for this? And we can make an offer to them, bring them on board, bring them into the stable, and put some of our own marketing muscle behind it and really get this thing to take off. Is there any truth to that, do you think? Or is it just like, look, if it's self-published, we don't even have time to even look at what's going on over there? Well, with the exception of E.L. James, of course.
Publishers are kind of reluctant to take on books that have previously been self-published unless the books are selling phenomenally well. And that means the hundreds of thousands of copies. But then if you're selling that much being self-published, why would you want to bother to be published by a traditional publisher? You know, they'll be getting 10% instead of, if you're self-published, you'll get 75%. And when I first got into this business back in 2008, the agenting business, self-publishing was relatively new, and publishers were talking a lot about acquiring self-published books. But that's changed now. They usually, if you have, they will usually want something new. And even if you have a successful self-published book, they'll say, well, let's see what you have. Let's see the next book.
So, I have to tell you that anytime I've approached agents, one of the things I've said is, this is my third manuscript. I've also written this one and that one, and I'm working on another one, with the idea in mind that an agent probably, and maybe a publishing house, is not interested in somebody who's going to be a one book wonder. They've written one book. That's all they had in them. And so even if it does well, then what? There's no encore performance. Does that matter to you? Do you think it matters to most agents? So whether
I think we'd all like to have somebody who can do a successful book every year or two. But I have a lot of clients who really only have one book. My most famous client is Daniel Ellsberg, and his book did very well. It was his memoir of being a nuclear scientist in the 60s. But he's 89 years old, so he's not going to have a second book. But this was an important book, and he's an important figure in American history. So I'm very proud of that book. But for novelists, I would much prefer to have someone who I think has more books in their head. But again, if I see if a book that I'm smitten with, I will take it on.
Yeah, you see an opportunity there.
Yes.
And if it does become a seller, it does well, that could motivate that author to decide, hey, I've got something going here, so I'm going to, and maybe even with your help, helping just develop the kind of the idea for the next one or what have you. Let me ask you how. Well, go ahead, finish that thought.
No, go ahead. No, it's fine. Yeah.
Well, you get all these manuscripts that come in. I want to ask you how manuscript, and specifically fiction manuscript, is treated when it comes to your agency. You've already kind of answered this in that you say, I don't even read most of them or basically any of them right now because I'm busy with ones that have already accepted. So what happens? It comes in by email for one thing. You don't want paper manuscripts anymore.
I prefer Word and Microsoft Word.
Mhm.
And I mean, whenever I get a novel from anyone that I decided that I want to work with, then they're almost never ready. And I think authors have difficulty. They don't have the perspective of the reader. I mean, why should they? They've got these characters and a story in their head that's been in their head for 5 years, and they can see movies and all kinds of stuff. But I try to put myself in the role of the reader, and if the reader is bored, or if the character isn't compelling, or if the dialogue sounds unnatural, then the author needs to know that. And a lot, I like Beauty of the Broken, which won this international award. When I got it, she had to do a lot of rewriting. And she was willing to do that. I know some authors who think their book is perfect, and they're difficult to work with because their books are never perfect.
And then you're suggesting some, or the editor's suggesting some alterations, and they're very resistant to the idea.
Well, I do a lot of editing, and some authors just don't want to change anything, and that is usually a problem.
Yeah, because that's kind of a formula for an agent saying, this person's hard to work
I had
with.
one person I was working with. Ultimately, we didn't work together, and they had a really great book, and the concept was a good concept, and he was a good writer, and he had a previous book that sold 40,000 copies, which is a lot. But the book had a lot of flaws, and I read it really carefully, and I told him exactly what I thought the flaws were. I'm pretty sure I was right about that. And he said, well, I don't want to change it right now. I've worked really hard on this thing. How about I let the publisher change it when we get to that point? Well, they were never going to get to that point because the publisher wouldn't want to acquire it if it was in that kind of half finished condition that it was in.
Now, what do aspiring novelists need to know about how the book publishing business works, but they rarely do? I mean, like, what are some of the big misconceptions you think novelists have out there? I mean, would-be novelists.
It has to be perfect, and it's about the voice. You have to have a good concept, but what it really is, it's like, I don't know how many people here read The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche, but he was writing about what he thought was the greatest artistic form ever created, which was Greek tragedy. And he said the reason Greek tragedy was so great is because it combined the Greek spirits of Apollo and Dionysus, Apollo being the spirit of reason, and Dionysus, the spirit of ecstasy. And that's what a great novelist has to do. They have to be able to have this imagination to conceive of a story, but then they have to be able to shape it into a work of art. They have to be able to do both, and that's what I think is important and what I am looking for. Okay.
Now, what do you consider to be the chief difference between literary fiction and commercial fiction? There's a lot of people out there, I mean, published novelists who write commercial fiction, but they've got literary impulses. They'll write, I'll give you an example. Now, John D. McDonald is a famous genre writer and very celebrated genre writer with his Travis McGee series of detective novels, but there's nothing he's written that is, I think, is anywhere. I mean, he wanted to step out of there, and he wrote A Key to the Suite, which is a fabulous novel. Fabulous. The writing is a celebration, and the story is great. And so I can't read his genre stuff because I read that, and I read Condominium, another one where he got rid of Travis McGee for a little while so he could write something different. And it was far richer. It was far more interesting instead of here's this guy who keeps reappearing and solving cases. Well, it's Groundhog Day. Now, John D. McDonald did it expertly, but there's an awful lot of people today. That's what they do. Now, I'm getting off course here because my original question was, what chief difference you see between literary fiction and commercial fiction?
I don't see a big difference. For one thing, it's just as hard to write good commercial fiction as writing literary fiction. I did a blog about this once. I did another interview with a literary fiction editor, and I interviewed a commercial fiction editor as well. And it's really more of a continuum. And on my napkin, I drew a continuum where on one side was Danielle Steele, and on the other side was Finnegan's Wake. And I said, where do you stand? And both the literary fiction editor and the person who is known for commercial fiction, they were very close to each other. One literary fiction tends to be more voice-driven, and literary fiction tends to be more plot-driven. But frankly, both literary and commercial fiction editors are looking for the compelling novel with a great plot and strong characters and good writing. There isn't that much of a difference. At a certain point, yes, Danielle Steele is not a great writer. Okay. And yes, Finnegan's Wake is hard for anyone to read, and publishers would not likely publish it these days. So I think the differences aren't necessarily that great. And it's, most of the books that I've worked on sort of are literary commercial sort of, they've got elements of both.
Let me give you an extreme example. E.L. James,
right,
in her 50 Shades of Grey series, it's terribly written, but she came up with a concept in a couple, just two characters. I mean, just a couple characters that, I was having this conversation with my wife years ago, just that, it's, if you come up with a good concept and you come up with a couple characters, the writing in her case seems almost to be incidental.
Well, it certainly was for her. But it just is, I can't quite explain that book. I don't know.
In its huge response. And movie is made after it and everything.
It wasn't well written, but there's a lot of other books that sell very well that aren't well written. But there's also some commercial writers who are wonderful writers. One of the most popular novelists in America now is Jodi Picoult. She's an excellent writer.
What kind of stuff does she does? I'm not familiar.
It's sort of, they call it upmarket women's fiction, and it's, I don't know why they call it that exactly. Mostly the audience is mostly women, although I read her stuff and I like it a lot. So it's but she sometimes she gets snubbed by literary writers. They say she's commercial. But she's very good, and some of these literary writers are just boring. And any editor will tell you they agree with they agree with that. Even literary fiction editors agree with that.
Now, we recently had, not very many years ago, just a few years back, there were two novels that came out that were considered great literary works and were also major bestsellers, one of which was The Goldfinch.
Right.
And then the other is All the Light That We Cannot See.
Right. I think they both.
Now, I didn't read The Goldfinch. My wife read The Goldfinch, and it's one of her favorite novels. I read All the Light We Cannot See, and except for one small stretch where he was obviously trying to get things back into gear and was showing off with the language, it was pretty much a masterpiece.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't finish Goldfinch. I lost interest in it, but she did have talent. And I did read All the Light You Cannot See, which was, I thought, a beautiful book. But it was about the French Resistance. Another book that was on a similar time and place was The Nightingale by Kristin Hannah, which is a beautiful book. It's funny. She's not literary, really. Her strength isn't so much in voice or in kind of the turn of the literary phrase, as much as it just kind of grabs you by the heart. You know, Faulkner said the only thing that matters is the human heart in conflict with itself. And somehow Kristin Hannah has reached that place. She's a wonderful writer.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you bring her up because my wife has just been on a tear with her. She's like read through everything that she has written. The only disappointment was her most recent one, which was, I think, she came out with like a holiday type book that was clearly just rushed out and was not at all on that level. But yeah, Kristin Hannah selling gobs of books, and definitely captured my wife. So Donna Tartt is the author of The Goldfinch, just because I want to get her name out there for the readers who are listeners who may be interested in readers. And then Anthony Doerr, Doerr, is All the Light That We Cannot See, and marvelously written book. Let me ask you this, Andy: if you had gotten a Nicholas Sparks novel that had come across in manuscript form, you don't even know who he is, he's not even published yet, do you think you would have looked at that and said, this guy is going to go somewhere, I want to represent him?
Maybe. Do
you know why I'm asking that question?
No, why?
Well, I thought you might know, but just because his stories are so incredibly simple. I mean, maybe that's what people are looking for, is just complete simplicity. But he takes kind of the traditional story that's been kind of run over millions of times, and he does these extremely simple stories, but they're fabulously successful, and then turned into movies to boot, which is amazing.
Well, he's very sentimental, but not a bad writer. I respect him. I'm pretty good friends with his editor, and she very much admires him. And it's one of those, and she says that, you know, the books he writes are just as difficult to write as The Goldfinch.
Well, oh boy, I know that's, but you know, who am I to say? Now, once you take an author on, you find an author like that, the gal you just read that opening paragraph for, you take her on as an author, anybody you're taking on as a new novelist. What do you expect from him or her beyond writing good material? What makes them a good client?
Well, as I said, they have to be realistic within their expectations, and they have to be able to listen to what I have to say. They don't always have to agree with me, but they shouldn't just. They need to be flexible. Publishers are also going to want to make changes, and if they have to be flexible with the publisher. It's always nice if you get a movie deal, but you have to have reasonable expectations. When they visualize a movie deal, they think of their characters that are deep and emotionally engaging, and scenes which are dramatic. And when publishers see it, they're thinking about how much will the costumes cost, and will 16-year-olds want to go? So they look at things a lot differently. And every novelist I know has said, well, I think this would make a great movie. And on one level, they're right. And by the way, this is the best time ever to try to do movie deals. There are so many venues, and it is a seller's market, but they see things differently than your novelist does. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I expect.
Now, you said that you're an editor as well. You edit the manuscripts. You don't you don't just say, well, if we can get an editor interested, that editor will be working with you. You prep it ahead of even taking it to an editor.
Yes.
What do you dig into most? I mean, do you sometimes, it's a phrase that's like, it just doesn't. It's a dissonant phrase. It's the voice has actually, that's not consistent with your voice there. Does it have to do with overwrought dialogue? Does it have to do with story structure? What would you say most often is
Well,
you have to go to work on?
when you're editing, there's sort of two levels. One is sort of the developmental editing, which is kind of the overall concept. And the other is line editing, which has to do with whether a particular dialogue sounds realistic, or, whether a character is acting out of character. So I do both.
How often do you say the ending, just you got to change the ending? People will not be satisfied.
I told Tawny Waters she had to rewrite the second half of the book, which she did, and she did it brilliantly.
What was wrong with the second half?
I'm trying to remember now. It was about 10 years ago. It didn't sort of have the kind of, there has to be a kind of rising action. It's sort of an Aristotelian pyramid where there's rising action that reaches a climax and then falling action to a denouement. And she got a little bit lost along the way, and I kind of had an idea where the climax should have been, but it required a considerable amount of rewriting, which she did, and she did it very well.
Now, you've already revealed some of this, but I'd like you to give us a picture of the professional activities of a literary agent other than reading and evaluating manuscripts. You obviously do that. You've already said that you edit. You don't do 3 martini lunches with editors. You get on Zoom or email them. So talk about a day or week in the life of a literary agent.
Well, there's only a few things that I do. Is I will read book proposals and novels that I'm working on. I'll do some editing. Editing takes a lot of concentration, so I can only do it for about an hour at a time. I do submissions. Submissions are pretty easy, but I have to research to see which editors are the right editors, and that takes some time. And then I kind of put out fires and field. I'm not just, agents are not just, we're not like real estate agents. We sort of are the allies of the author, and we maintain our relationship throughout the whole process, even after it gets published. I have a book right now, my client does, called The Nine, and it's a nonfiction book, a true story of 9 women who were in the French Resistance, who were captured and put into slave labor in the Third Reich and then engineered an escape. And the book is doing very well, but there are questions about international rights. There was a movie deal that took a year to negotiate. And, and then the author is a very good promoter of the book, but she wants advice, and I have to give it to her, and I love giving it to her. So that's pretty much what I do all day.
Interesting. So, do you find that this is I'm kind of revisiting a theme here, but do you find that would-be novelists too often, and actually you were talking about the opportunities have never been bigger to actually get something from book to screen because of Netflix and all these different channels, these different channels that are available.
Right.
So do you find that more people are starting to write cinematically, or can you sometimes get manuscripts that you look at and it's like, this is almost like a treatment or it's a movie script, not a book?
Well, movie scripts are a lot different than novels, and it's sort of, it's up to the producer who acquires they call it the intellectual property, to find a screenwriter who can do an adaptation. One of my novelist clients, Jeff Arch, is a screenwriter. He wrote Sleepless in Seattle, one of everybody's most favorite movies, the most romantic movie of all time. And he's writing a screenplay for it now, but it's going to be considerably different than what the novel is.
Now, what's the title of the novel?
It's called Attachments.
Attachments, okay. And the movie may have a completely different name, of course. Now,
it hasn't been acquired as a movie yet, but he's writing a screenplay for it, and hopefully something will happen.
So, as an agent, the standard is what, 15% on books, 20% on movies and TV deals?
No, not really. It is, the commission is normally 15% for the income flowing from books. Okay. But when I do a movie deal, and I have to use another agent, like an entertainment agent, I will take 20%, but I'd split it with the entertainment agent. I'd end up getting him at 10%. If I negotiate it directly without another agent, I'd still take 15%.
I see. Okay. Now, you had said earlier that you have a blog. It's called Ask the Agent. It's on your website. And talk about what you seek to accomplish with the blog. What is it that you want to communicate through your blog, and to what effect?
I haven't been doing it lately. It's sort of it's a little bit defunct, but it was. I have a lot of good information on that blog, and also I did a lot of kind of whimsical stuff. But I have lots of information about how to write a book proposal, how to write a query letter. I did some kind of reminiscing about Cody's books. I did interviews with authors. And it was a lot of fun when I did it. I just don't have enough time to keep doing it now. It's very time consuming. So
it's just hit and miss. I mean, every so often you'll do it. But you said it's basically defunct. You probably haven't written it for a while.
Well, I haven't been doing much lately, yeah.
Now, if you're at a cocktail party and you run into somebody who says that, hey, I've got a manuscript and you're an agent, I'd like to send it over to you. And it's an avant-garde novel. Mm-hmm. When somebody says avant-garde, would that be something that might interest you? Or is it kind of the sort of thing where, that's just not where it's happening right now?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that. That just kind of scares people. Avant-garde sometimes that means boring. But usually if somebody approaches me and they ask me, and I'll say, sure, send 10 pages.
And by 10 pages, on the first page whether or not it's somebody.
I can tell if they've got talent on the first page. I can't tell if the novel's going to work.
Now, I can tell you, Andy, that there's a lot of books that I'll get, and boy, those first 25 or 35 pages are just they really sing. Mm-hmm. And there's a drop off after that. And I think most agents out there say, send me your first 10 pages, or send me. In your case, you say you're a chapter, 20, probably 25 pages. I've never seen anybody really ask for more than 50.
I usually ask for 10. But if I get to the 10th page and I want to read more, which I usually don't, I'll ask for the rest of the manuscript, and I'll keep reading it until sometimes it's page 11, and sometimes I get, what I'm looking for is being up at 3:00 in the morning and reading those last 6 letters, THEEND, crying like a baby. That is what I want.
You don't get that a lot, though. That's a rarity.
Doesn't happen that often, but if I don't cry, I don't buy.
Well, I mean, but there's a lot of so you're somebody who really wants to be moved emotionally,
right?
And you want it to speak to your chest, not your head,
right? You
don't want it to be white noise. You want it to be to name a highly emotional novel that would make you cry.
Oh,
although the light that we cannot see actually is an emotional.
It certainly
novel.
Was, yeah,
yeah,
it certainly was,
yeah. So, what are you reading right now? Do you read at all outside of your work as an agent? Do you have time to sit down with a good book that an author that you especially like? Do you read Kurt Vonnegut still or anything like that?
Yeah, I do read every night, but a lot of times I'm just reading my client's stuff.
So if I said, what book are you reading right now? It's not going to be coming from a bookstore. It's going to be people who have sent you
At the
material.
moment, yes.
Okay. All right. What's your, can you name me your favorite one or three novels of all time?
I liked War and Peace. I liked
That's a
Wuthering
commitment.
Heights.
Wuthering Heights. Okay. That's what Charlotte, no, it's Emily Bronte,
Emily
right?
Bronte.
Now you talk about crying. My sister, I have three sisters, but I have a sister, and anytime that would come on, and she would watch it, and she was in love with Heathcliff, and by the end of that movie, she was bawling. I mean, sobbing. So obviously, the Brontes, particularly Emily, in that case, knew how to reach inside and grab the heart.
That's right. Yeah.
So, what else should our aspiring novelists know? What other kind of bullet points would you offer to them? I now be realistic. Number one, don't expect to get rich. Although every once in a while lightning strikes. Um, you can send me a manuscript, but chances are I won't read it. At least not right now. Um,
Well, I will
is there some?
respond very quickly. Um, don't send anything out until it's ready, and try to figure out what I mean by ready, because most people don't understand that. Um, be realistic.
What is ready?
Master the craft, and then go beyond the craft.
Mm-hmm. So when you say it really needs to be ready, what is ready to you?
Let's just say it has to be perfect.
Okay, the story holds together. It's got the arc is right, the timing is good, the pacing is good, and it has an ending that is
it has strong
satisfying.
characters. It has a plot with momentum that makes me want to turn the pages. It puts me into a trance-like state while I'm reading it. In other words, it's a page turner.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm in the story. That's the way it's got to be.
Do you read
some of
novels?
That you can learn. Some of that you can't learn. You just have.
Do you ever say to your people submitting, well, people that you're talking to, that you've gotten to the point where you're actually, well, maybe not even that stage. It's just if you get interested enough to read a manuscript and you can't find a likable character, are you out?
Well, they have to be characters I engage with. They don't always have to be likable, although that helps. But you have to care about them one way or another.
It's interesting because there's a show on right now called Succession that's been a big hit.
Yeah, I know that show.
You know that show, okay?
Nobody's likable, but other people liked it because they're all engaging.
And it's family warfare. It's family warfare. So
yeah, I found it very annoying, but it's been very successful, and I can see it's artfully done.
It is artfully done. The writing is terrific, but the writing is about people being basically savaging one another, and these are brothers and sisters and father and son and daughter and all that. But the writing is very good. But I'm with you. I almost gave up on it because it's just I don't like any of these people. I wanted to see them all fail. They're all mean to each other, and so on. And yet it's a big hit. So. And I don't think the Tom Wolfe, Bonfire of the Vanities, who was likable in that? I mean, nobody really.
Bonfire of the Vanities, but you're right. They weren't, but it was engaging.
Yes.
But still, I've gotten books by people who are incredibly talented, and I just don't like any of the characters, and I can't read 400 pages of people who I just don't like at all. But other agents may, in fact, be willing to be more engaged with a darker kind of novel than I am.
What's the most exciting thing happening right now in the book, the book publishing industry?
I can't answer that question. I don't
Is there anything new that you're seeing happening right now that's kind of like, hey, that's a nice turn of events. This is a good thing. I mean, for
no, I
instance,
don't think there's
audiobooks
no,
are exploding.
there's no trend that I see. It's with books, it's usually more about the particular book.
Well, YA is a big trend.
YA was a
Audio,
big trend, and then they overpublished YA, and now it's very
uh,
difficult to get YA published. Middle grade is easier to get published now. Like mostly like with for ages 10 to 13 or 14, something like that. But YA, they just they got really enthusiastic with Harry Potter and with and Twilight actually, and the Hunger Games.
yeah,
But then they went
Hunger
and
Games.
published too much, and they've gotten kind of burned.
Well, and I think one of the morals of those stories is that if something like a legal thriller or a vampire series is hot, you don't want to jump in for that reason. You want to write what is meaningful to you, but trying to jump on a trend. By the time you get something written and you put it in an agent's hands or an editor's hands, it's probably flaming out by then.
Yes.
It's kind of like we've overpublished now. Good book, nice effort, but you know what? We couldn't stand another
YA,
vampire
I like
book right
YA
now.
a lot, and I like middle grade, but I prefer realistic kinds of books rather than fantasy or paranormal because realism is always in fashion.
Well, Andy, I appreciate you taking the time. This is it's interesting because there's so many people who are looking to be published authors now, and obviously the focus of this podcast has to do with fiction writers, novelists, and what have you.
And some of them will be because they're always looking for good fiction. In spite of what I've said, which is probably discouraging, people are getting published. Novels are
it has been discouraging, to tell you the truth. I mean, a lot of what you said is discouraging, but people have to be sober about it. They have to be realistic, like you say. And I think there are a lot of people out there they're thin-skinned, and they also are, they've got in their head that, I mean, when you read about certain authors who have hit big, it sounds like there's an opportunity there. There is an opportunity to write a book and get it published, but the idea that you're going to, be on the silver screen and pull down
books,
millions of dollars in advance.
There's as many books getting published now as there ever were, and there's also other opportunities. If you can't get published by Random House, you can self-publish your book. Of course, then you have to be able to market it. So it's sort of a challenge, but I try not to discourage people, but I do want people to be realistic and to realize, they've got to understand that writing a book kind of opens up your heart to the world, and publishing, it doesn't do any of that. It doesn't make you famous. It doesn't make you rich. It's sort of a business transaction. And so if you do get rejected, it's important to remember it's not because of your writing so much. It's because of other considerations. Publishing is a business, and that you should just move on to the next book. Most of the successful novelists I know had 5 books that got rejected and weren't any good. And then something happened and they became established.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's also the whole question of, are you writing because you want to get something out there because writing has an appeal to you? There's an appeal in saying that I'm a writer and I'm an author, or I'm a fiction writer, or is it really innate to you? I mean, Sylvia Plath said, the reason I write is because there's a voice inside of me that will not let me stop writing.
Most of the authors I have worked with who have said the same thing. I ask them, how do you come up with these stories? And they say, I can't stop having them come to me.
Exactly. So in the spotlight, Andy Ross of Andy Ross, a literary agency. And Andy, I think you have given us a lot of valuable information here. And I really appreciate you taking the time. You've been generous with your time. We're over an hour right now, so and you were willing to let it fly. So thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with the manuscripts that come over the transom.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed speaking to you.